Corinthians chapter 9 is where we'll be today, and we should finish up chapter 9 today, and we'll see as Paul kind of puts an end to this larger section that we've been looking at. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in the seat backs in front of you. Feel free to grab that and use that today. If you don't own a Bible, then feel free to take that one with you when you go. Consider that our gift to you. We're in a large section of the book of 1 Corinthians where it started in chapter 8, and Paul is addressing the issue of Christian liberties. Now, we've defined this a couple times, that Christian liberties are the gray areas of life. The gray areas that some Christians think are allowed and other Christians think they're wrong. And so there are these gray areas where a church and a believer has to decide whether that is something that they can or should participate in or not. And they're a gray area because the Bible doesn't say one way or the other. The Bible doesn't address the topic, and so it's a gray area, not a black and white. The gray area in Corinth that Paul was dealing with was, can a Christian eat meat that has been offered to an idol? And so that's kind of their gray area issue. And if you remember, Paul ended chapter 8 by giving them a big principle. And here it is in verse 13. He said, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." And the big idea that Paul gave us is this: my brother is more important than my right. My brother is more important than my right. And this issue, this formula, it works for any gray issue that we may have. If I'm convinced that I have a right to get a tattoo, well, I now have another question I have to ask. Not, is it my right? Now my question is, would my tattoo, would it make a weaker believer stumble? That's the principle. My brother is always more important than my right. Last week, and we moved into chapter 9 where Paul was giving a long illustration about how this principle works in real life. And you remember, Paul started by establishing his freedom. Paul is free to do whatever is biblically right to do. If the Scripture allows it, then Paul is free to do it. But then Paul established his right. Not just his freedom, but then Paul established his right. Specifically, Paul established his right to be paid by a church. And Paul made an airtight case that a pastor should be paid by the church. So now, here's where we're at. This is where we left it. Paul has established his freedom, and Paul has established his right. Now, what is Paul going to do with them? Look at the beginning of verse 15. "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision." So Paul establishes his freedom, he establishes his right, and now we come to verse 15 and we see that Paul refuses to use his right. He established it, it's real, it's there, but Paul refuses to use it. Remember that big idea from chapter 8. My brother is more important than my right. So now let's plug the issue in. Who is Paul's brother? The Corinthians. And what is Paul's right? To be paid. So what do we get? The Corinthians are more important than being paid. You see, you take the big principle that my brother is more important than my right, and then you begin to plug in who is my brother and what are my rights, and you get these kind of statements. The Corinthians are more important than being paid. Why? Because the Corinthians were Paul's brothers, and Paul's right was to be paid. But my brother is more important than my right. Keep looking at verse 15. Look what he says. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. I haven't made any use of my right to be paid. Paul says, I'm not using this as an example so that you'll start paying me. He tells them the same thing I told you last week. This is not a desperate appeal for a raise. He said, I would rather die. And that's not a literal statement. We know from other Greek manuscripts that statement, I would rather die, is the way that they culturally meant that something was serious, that it was important. We might say it this way: cross my heart, hope to die. Do you really hope to die? Are you suicidal if that doesn't happen? No. What are you communicating? You're communicating, this is serious to me. I mean this. And so Paul says, I would rather die. I mean this. This is serious. Well, what's he so serious about? I would rather die than be deprived of my right to boast. Now, what does the word boast mean? It means to glory in, to rejoice in. So what is Paul talking about? He's saying, I refused to use my right of payment among you. I refused that because I didn't want to lose my right to boast. I didn't want to lose my right to rejoice. I didn't want to lose my right to glory in something. What? Is Paul going to boast in the fact that he gets to preach the gospel? Look at verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. That's not it. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. So Paul said, I'm not talking about preaching because I can't boast about preaching. Why? Because I'm required to do this. I love this phrase. Necessity is laid upon me. Did you know that a man doesn't just decide to preach? I didn't choose this on career day at Christian school. My dad didn't tell me, hey, this is the family business. That's what we do. We pastor, we preach. No, listen, the Lord and the Lord alone calls a man to preach. And if the Lord hasn't called him, he ain't called. If the Lord doesn't lay necessity on a man, he is not a preacher. No matter how many times he gets behind a pulpit, necessity is laid on me. One of the things I love about the Old Testament is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah talks about the fact that he was kind of a mild-mannered guy. And he kept preaching, and everybody's like, we hate you, Jeremiah. You're the worst prophet ever. You're terrible. We don't want to hear your message. And so Jeremiah said, I decided that I wasn't going to say anything else. I went home and I quit and I was done and I wasn't going to preach anymore. And he says, but his word was like a fire that was just shut up in my bones and I couldn't do anything but proclaim. That's what it means to have necessity laid on you. And Paul said, so I can't boast about preaching. Why? Because I'm required to preach. It's necessity that has been laid on me. Verse 17. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. If I'm preaching because I called myself, then preaching is my reward. I called myself, so I get up there and I do it. That's what I wanted. I got it. Paul said, if necessity is laid on you and you understand that the only way to truly be called to preach is from the Lord and necessity is laid on you, then it is no longer of your own will. I hope you understand that I don't spend the week trying to figure out what I'm going to say. I don't try to figure out a sermon and put one together and manufacture it in a way that's going to be appealing or is going to draw people in. No, listen, necessity is laid on me to do what He has called me to do. And all that He has called me to do is to tell others what He has said. That's why I spend time digging in to find out what He said so that I'm being a good steward. I'm telling you exactly what He said. Paul said, I didn't call myself to preach. It was not of my own will, so I am entrusted with a stewardship. I didn't call me to preach, so I don't get to decide how I do it. I'm under necessity from the Lord, and I am just a steward of what He has required me to do. If you hire somebody to cut your grass, and you tell them, I want you to cut my grass every Friday, and I want that setting set at 2.25. That's the height that my grass is supposed to be. Who owns that grass? You do. But you're hiring someone as a steward to take care of your grass. Does the steward get to come and go, you know what, Friday is a terrible day to cut grass. I'm going to cut grass on Tuesday. And 2.25, that was so 1990. We're going to set it to 3. No, they don't get to do that. Why? Because it's not their grass. They're simply a steward of it. You have paid them to be a steward of what belongs to you. Do you understand? That's what preaching is. Preaching is not the pastor decides how he wants to do it and it's 2.25 or it's 3. No, it is the Lord owns His word. It belongs to Him, and the preacher is just a steward of the message. Paul verse 18 says, what then is my reward? If it's not preaching, what's my reward? What do I have to boast about? That in my preaching, I don't have to, it's not required, I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. What then is my reward? Remember, we're trying to answer this question. What is Paul boasting about? What does Paul have to glory in? It's not preaching. What is it? It's preaching for free. His reward, his boast, his rejoicing was that he specifically had the ability to preach and present the gospel free of charge. He had the opportunity to do that because he refused his right to be paid. This wasn't, and it isn't, a requirement for all preachers. That's why he framed it, that in my preaching I may. Not I must or not I'm required, but I may. I have the opportunity to offer the gospel without charge. So Paul established last week his right to be paid. And here we see where Paul refuses to use his right to be paid. But remember last week, he also established his freedom. What is Paul going to do with his freedom? Verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a slave a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So Paul established his right. He refused to use his right. Paul established his freedom. And now we see that Paul refuses to use his freedom. Paul spent the beginning of chapter 9 establishing his right to be paid just so he could demonstrate his refusal of the right. He established his freedom in chapter 9, and now he's going to demonstrate his refusal of even his own freedom. Verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. I'm free from all, Paul said. I've already established that. But even though I'm free, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. Did you notice what Paul's motivation for refusing to use his freedom is? He said, I do all of this so that I might win more of them. Paul is enslaving himself to others so that he might win more of them. Paul was completely willing to sacrifice his habits, his preferences, his entire lifestyle just for the opportunity of winning more people to Christ. What does it look like to give up your freedom? What does it look like to enslave yourself to others for the sake of the gospel? Paul's going to give us 3 examples in our passage here. In verse 20, he's going to tell us the Jewish example. Look at verse 20. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. This is pretty interesting to me. Paul says, when we're talking about the Jews, to the Jews, I became as a Jew. What was Paul? A Jew. Catch that. Why would Paul, a Jew, say that he became as a Jew? Because there's a distinction between being a Jew nationally and being a Jew religiously. So Paul said, I have enslaved myself to the Jews so that when I'm around them, I live like them. I keep the festivals. I keep the dietary laws. I follow the law. Was Paul under the law? No, he had freedom. Though, he says, not being myself under the law. Paul said, I'm not under the law. I'm free from that. For the 3rd time in about 7 weeks, the Bible has been clear that modern believers are not under the Old Testament law. There are many false teachers and preachers online who are trying to prove to modern believers that you must keep the law. Pay careful attention to what Paul says here. Yes, sometimes I keep the law, but never because I have to. Never because I'm under it. I keep the law so that I don't offend those who are under the law, that I might reach those who are under the law. That's the Jewish example. In verse 21, he gives us the Gentile example. To those outside the law, Gentiles, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. Those outside the law, that's Gentiles. He said, I became as a Gentile. Now catch this. I, Paul, a Jew, lived like a Gentile. Why? That I might win those. who weren't under the law. This is an important little phrase. Paul said, I didn't live outside the law of God. Now, wait a minute, Paul. You just, in verse 21, said you weren't under the law. And now in verse 22, you're saying you're not outside the law of God. Which is it? Well, it's very simple, actually. Paul's saying, I'm not under the law of Moses, but I didn't live lawless. I didn't just live like there were no rules and go do whatever I wanted to do. I was still under the law of God. It was the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. But I did all of that, again, my motivation, that I might win those outside the law. Then at the beginning of verse 22, he gives us the weak example. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win weak. To those who are weak, I live weak. I don't do things that violate their weak conscience. For the third time, that I might win them. And then at the end of verse 22, he throws out another big principle. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Paul said to the Jew, I lived like a Jew. I wasn't under the law. I didn't have to, but I lived under the law. Why? That I might reach them. To the Gentile, Paul said, I lived like a Gentile. I forgot all the laws. I didn't keep the dietary stuff. I did what the Gentiles do. Why? That I might reach some. And to the weak, I didn't do certain things that violated their conscience, even though I could. Why? That I might reach them. You see the motivation? It's the same motivation all the way through. It's not, I lived like a Jew to be closer to God. I lived like a Gentile because I'm free in Christ. No, that wasn't any of it. It was, I lived like them that I might reach them. At 2 o'clock today, do you know what me and most of my family will be gathered around our TV watching? You're not going to know because nobody here cares about it. NHL playoff hockey. Because the Buffalo Sabres broke a 14-year playoff streak and are playing in the NHL playoffs. And you go, who cares? And before I moved up there, I would have been right there with you. The only good reason to watch hockey was a good fight might break out. But you know what? When I got to Buffalo, I realized they don't talk about college basketball. That's what I love and what I know. They didn't talk about college football because they didn't really have a college team that played much football or that they cared about. But you know what every man up there talked about? Bills football and Sabres hockey. So in order to become all things to all people, do you know what our family got into? We got into hockey. Why? Just so we could talk to people and know them and be a part of their lives. And one of my friends in Buffalo, he's not saved. He and I text every week, and the thing we text about is Sabres hockey. Because I became all things to him. Things I didn't care about, I decided, I made myself care about. I didn't know what was going on for 3 years, but I sat there and watched, hoping I would learn the sport. So that I had something that I could talk to him about, that I might reach him. You see? I became all things to all people, that by all means, even hockey, I might save some. Verse 23, I do it all. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing. See, the gospel drives everything for Paul. So Paul proves that he's free, and then he refuses to use that freedom. And Paul proves that he has a right to be paid, and then he refuses to use that right. And he closes out this chapter by giving us one final illustration. And I love this, a final illustration in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run, that you may obtain it. Now, Paul goes very basic here. We've got kids in our house. One's playing 12-year-old baseball, and then we've got 4-year-old wee ball, and then 3-year-old t-ball going on at our house. So baseball's on 3 different levels in the York house right now. And to Haddon, at 12-year-old, I'm talking a lot of the mechanics of you're going to move your body this way, and you got to get your hips through first, and you got to pull that knob toward the ball. And I'm giving him all of these instructions. And to Judd, I'm like, hey, keep your eye on it. Watch it. And to Emmy, I'm like, don't put dirt in your glove. Just watch the batter. Pay attention. Right? Okay. Paul's going T-ball level here. You ready? Do you not know that in a race all the runners run? So there's a starting line, and there's 10 runners, and the gun goes off. How many of the 10 run? All 10. Okay? But only one receives the prize. Paul biblically did not believe in participation trophies. All right? He didn't believe everybody gets a trophy. That's not true biblically. You can biblically prove not everybody gets a trophy in life. Only the one who won the race. That's who gets the trophy. Don't you know that in a race, all 10 runners run, but only one gets the prize? It's like what my coach used to say. Second place is first loser. Duh, Paul. So what? We know that all the runners run, but only one wins. What's your point? You ready? Run to win. Run that you may obtain the prize. Go for gold. Just do it. Anything worth doing is worth winning. Don't be a loser, Paul says. Now, the coach in me loves this part of Paul. But what's his point? Verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. One of the things that most people don't realize about pro athletes, because everybody goes, man, I'd love to just play football for a living. I'd love to play golf for a living. I'd love to play baseball for a living. Do you know how disciplined the lives of those pro athletes are? Amanda actually nannied for an NBA player when she lived in Columbus years and years ago. And the extreme self-discipline that man lived under of the things that he would eat and the things that he would not eat, simply so he could keep his body in tip-top shape to perform as an athlete. Let me take the illustration a little further. Let me put an image on the screen. See if you can tell me who this is. Who is this? Ellie De La Cruz, starting shortstop, phenom, generational talent for the Cincinnati Reds. Okay? Now, I'm going to put an equally phenomenal athlete up. You ready? All right. That's me. Now, on one side, you have Ellie De La Cruz. On the other side, me. Let me ask you this. out of those two athletes, which one would eat this? Ellie or me? Me. Who drinks this? Ellie or me? Me. You see? A professional athlete is free to eat this. He has the right, as an American, to eat this. But you know what he chooses to do? He chooses to say, no way. Because I want to be a winner. I want to run the bases at record speed. He has the freedom to drink this. He has the right to drink this. But you know what? He freely chooses to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Why? Because I want to win. I want to win. Verse 25, so every athlete exercises self-control. He says no to the Snickers. He says no to the Coke. He says, I say no. I exercise self-control in all things. Why? Because they want to win World Series. They want to win Super Bowls. They want to win Stanley Cups. They want to cut down the nets in March. Look at verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath. But we, an imperishable. A wreath, that was their trophy. What Paul's referencing here, remember Corinth is on the Isthmus of Greece. And what Corinth had was the Isthmian Games, which was the twin to the Olympic Games. So Corinth was a sports town. And so these Isthmian Games would go on. And if you won the Isthmian Games, you got a wreath that they would hang it around your neck. And that way everybody knew you were the winner. You sacrificed the most. You did the best. Why? Because you have the wreath. But those wreaths weren't silk and plastic. They were real. So what happened to that wreath? It would wilt. And it would shrink. And it would lose its color. And it would die. Paul said, think about how disciplined an athlete is. And all he's trying to do is get a wreath that's going to wither. But think about how undisciplined you are as a believer in Christ, and you are chasing after something that is eternal. It doesn't wither. It doesn't rot. It doesn't change color. We are laying up treasure in heaven where moth and rust does not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. We have the opportunity to discipline ourselves for a reward that does not perish. Verse 26, so I do not run aimlessly. Paul said, I don't just run anywhere. You ever see these guys that exercise, they run on the side of the road? I'm always going, where are they going? I know they know where they're going, but where are you going? They're just running. And Paul said, listen, I don't just do a Forrest Gump and just start running aimlessly and nobody know where I'm going. No. I run with a purpose. I'm an athlete and I'm on a track and I'm in lane 3 and I'm going to run in lane 3 and I'm not going to veer into lane 2 and I'm not going to swerve into lane 4. I'm running lane 3. I don't run aimlessly. I discipline myself to be healthy. I practice to be fast. I restrict myself to stay in my lane. Why? Because I want to win. He then changes metaphors. Verse 26, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air. He moves sports. He goes from running to boxing. I don't know if you've ever seen a boxer when he practices. But they call it shadow boxing, where he's here and he punches the air. There's nobody there. There's nobody punching back, but he's practicing with his shadow boxing. And Paul said, I don't shadow box. I don't beat the air. I beat an opponent. Why? Because I'm fighting the good fight. I'm actually competing because I want to win. Verse 27, but I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. I discipline my body. I keep it under control. Paul said, I tell my body what to do. My body says, eat a Snickers. And Paul said, I go, no. My body says, drink a Coke. And Paul said, I say, no. My body says, oh, sleep in and be lazy. And Paul says, no. He said, I discipline my body. I tell me what to do. I keep it under control. Lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. 2 chapters, Paul has dealt very difficultly with Christian liberties, gray areas. How do we handle them? What do we do? Let me distill it down quickly into 3 little things that we're supposed to do. Number 1, run to win. Be competitive. Live the Christian life as a winner. What do winners do? Anything they want? No. We actually learned that what winners do is they limit themselves. They discipline themselves. They tell themselves no. A pro athlete is pro because he learned how to tell himself no more than I did. Do I have the freedom to do this gray area thing? Who cares if you have the freedom? Run to win. Limit yourself. Be disciplined. Do I have the right to do this or the right to do that? Who cares? Run to win. Limit yourself. Be disciplined for something better. Listen to me. Some of you don't live in spiritual victory because you just won't discipline yourselves. You won't tell yourself no. Sunday mornings are optional for you. If we feel like it, we'll go. If there's nothing better going on, we'll go. You'll be here, but every week it's a decision. Are we going this week? Are we not? Professional athletes don't wake up and go, am I going to work out today? They get up and they do it. Why? Because they're disciplined. A pro golfer gets up and he goes, I don't know if I'm going to go hit balls today or not. No, they hit thousands a day. Why? Because they're disciplined and they're working at their craft. Olympic gold medalist, he was a wrestler, Dan Gable said, and I quote, gold medals aren't really made of gold. They're made of sweat, determination, and a hard-to-find alloy called guts. Love that quote. Success as an athlete is not as much talent as it is determination and decision-making. And many of you live defeated spiritual lives simply because you won't discipline yourself enough to do what you're supposed to do. And then you wonder why I'm lethargic and I don't feel like serving and I just don't get the feeling I got before and all of these things. It comes from I didn't decide to discipline myself to do what I'm supposed to do to be a spiritual winner. So run to win. The second thing I think we learn is this: don't be offensive. Don't be offensive. Paul said, I've become all things to all people. I'm not going to be offensive to anybody. Paul said, if my Jewish friend is going out to eat with me, then I'm not going to order bacon. I'm free to order bacon. I have the right to order bacon, and I really like bacon. But I want to win then, so I don't order bacon. But if my Gentile friend invites me over for dinner, and he fixed bacon, eat it. Don't be offensive. Don't say to the Gentile friend, no, I'm under the law, I don't eat pork. Eat, Paul says. Enjoy. Why? That you may win them. Because God doesn't care what you eat. And God doesn't care what you don't eat. Too many Christians are defined by what they do and don't do. Their whole Christian life is defined by their convictions. And I'm not talking about caving and being soft on black and white issues. Those we cannot move on. But what I mean is these people define themselves by gray areas. I'm a Christian who doesn't get tattoos. Cool. I'm a King James only Christian. I'm a free Christian. I can wear whatever I want and talk however I want. Each one of these freedoms is often offensive, and we just flaunt our rights without caring that we might be losing the opportunity to win some. So Paul says, run to win. Paul says, don't be offensive. And the third thing he says is, do everything with the gospel in mind. The gospel ought to be the deciding factor in everything in your life. You are not to be controlled by your rights. You are not to be controlled by your freedoms. We are people who are driven by the gospel. And if doing something helps the gospel, count me in. And if disciplining myself and refraining from doing something helps the gospel, then I'll do that. This should not be a shock to you, but the greatest example of giving up your freedom and your right and your liberty for others is our Savior Jesus. He had the right to heaven. He had the freedom as God to do whatever He willed to do. And yet, Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 that He emptied Himself out. He poured out all of those qualities. Why? That we might be saved. You see, it's not about, I know my right and I'm going to fight for it. I know my freedom and I'm going to live in it. No. Paul's encouraging us to be like Jesus and say, I don't care what my rights are. I don't care what my freedoms are. I'm going to live in a way that serves you. Why? Because like an athlete, I'm going to discipline myself, and I'm going to take my rights and throw them away, and I'm going to take my freedoms and not partake. Why? Because I want to be a winner. And ultimately, this passage is bringing you to a decision. What kind of Christian do you want to be? Do you want to be a winner who is victorious and making successes for the gospel and the kingdom of God? Or do you want to be a Christian that's a loser, fighting for their rights and fighting for their freedoms and caring not who goes to hell in the wake of their right and their freedom? Paul said, I establish my right And I refused it. Why? That I might win some. And I established my freedom, but I refused it. Why? That I might win some.